you're going to learn how to write a persuasive speech. What I've done is I've taken 4 separate videos that were all really designed to go together in the first place, and I've stitched them all together here in one place for you. So let's learn how to write a persuasive speech together. It's much easier to understand what a persuasive message design is when we contrast it with a more traditional informative speech. Most presentations in professional settings are not technically persuasive. In fact, the vast majority have the goal of simply informing your listeners to one level or another. We're often sharing information, showing people how to do things, training, teaching, or otherwise bringing people up to speed on an issue. Most informative presentations are structured around 3 basic parts that you will likely recognize: an introduction, body, and conclusion. The main points or buckets in the body of a presentation are typically numbered first, second, and third. This bare bones classic structure is what drives most informative speeches. What makes a presentation persuasive rather than merely informative is not simply a matter of delivering the material in a convincing, compelling, or emotionally engaging way. What makes a presentation persuasive is when we are trying to change listeners' minds or behaviors by the end of the speech. Before the presentation, your listeners are at point A, and by the end, you're trying to change their minds or behaviors to meet you at point B. And to do that, we have to structure our message differently to bring listeners along on that journey with us. Now, like an informative speech, a persuasive speech structure still has an introduction, body, and conclusion. The introduction to an informative and persuasive speech are almost identical, in fact. You usually start by grabbing your audience's attention in some way, like telling a story or sharing an interesting statistic. Some people call this your hook or your opening. You then explain why the topic is relevant to your listeners. Next, you establish your credibility as a speaker who is worth listening to for this topic and for this audience. You then give your bottom line or thesis statement, and then you give a preview or a roadmap of the rest of your presentation. With some minor differences, the introduction for a persuasive speech is the same as that informative structure. But the 3 points in the middle of the body of the presentation are organized in a way that take listeners on a persuasive journey. That's where most of the differences are. And that's why we're going to emphasize the 3 body points in this video. Instead of simply saying first, second, and third to inform listeners about those 3 items or steps, persuasive messages organize the main points in the body around problem, solution, and benefits in that exact order. Some people use different labels for these 3 main points. Instead of calling the first point the problem, some people might describe it as the need. Instead of calling the second point the solution, you'll sometimes see this labeled as the plan, the recommendation, or the satisfaction step, like they do with Monroe's motivated sequence. People usually label the third point benefits, but it's sometimes labeled as the visualization step or sometimes visualization of benefits. But the heart of these are the same, even though the labels may change. The foundation is the problem, solution, benefits. Now, are there other ways to organize the body of a persuasive message? Yes, and I'm going to show you a few alternatives in the next video, part 2 of this series. Using problem, solution, and benefits to structure your main points is really the classic way to organize the body of a persuasive speech, and I'll prove it to you. I love old television commercials, the classic commercials, because they use this recipe almost exactly. In the problem phase of the commercial, they show some athletes, for example, who are in the middle of an important game and they're exhausted. That's the problem. Next, the solution is Gatorade or some other sports drink. They show people in the commercial chugging some blue or red beverage. Then they show the benefits. Those same athletes with a renewed energy out on the field, making plays, winning the game. A lot of those classic television commercials happen in the kitchen. They show a kitchen that has some problem, like the cabinets are all disorganized and things are falling out because of the lack of good storage containers. This is causing that person in the kitchen stress and anxiety. Next is the solution, which is a uniform nesting system of plastic storage containers. They show the person using those containers to get everything organized and sorted out. And they finish with the benefits by showing a nice, tidy, organized kitchen. The inside of the cabinets look great, but most importantly, everybody's happy about this. Advertisers love this because the problem, solution, benefits points tell a story. This approach takes listeners on a satisfying emotional and psychological journey. The television advertisers stole this formula from the world of public speaking that goes back as far as Aristotle over 2,000 years ago when he wrote a book about public speaking called Rhetoric. But for speeches, we don't want to come across in that exaggerated way like the old TV commercials. I'm just using those examples to help us remember the problem, solution, benefits points. So how could you use these points in a persuasive speech? We're going to use them in the body of the speech. Let's take a little more realistic example. In a professional setting, you might be doing a presentation in your organization where you're trying to convince your listeners to invest in a new and expensive marketing plan to grow your business. Let's say your company has not been growing much and has been surviving mostly by cutting costs, but you want to convince the company's leaders to change their approach and find ways to grow the business through more marketing. The problem point for your persuasive speech would likely be focused on the fact that many customers are not aware of your product. You might focus on your decreased market share. You might want to talk about the lack of existing marketing efforts happening in your company to show that there's a real issue here that's not working. There's a clear gap or need to get the word out to potential customers. That's the problem. Next, you move to your solution point. In this particular speech, your solution is to recommend an ambitious marketing program. In that solution step, you would spell out all of the relevant details, the exact steps involved in your proposed plan. You would talk about things like the costs, timeline, who would be involved. And then you move to your benefits step, which would be to help listeners see the potential upsides of adopting your solution. You would paint a vivid picture. You might use some success stories, for example, about similar organizations that have engaged in marketing campaigns like this. You could show data and results from past successes in your own company when you've made similar levels of investments. If this were a more technical presentation, you might use some simulations or modeling to forecast future benefits. This example assumes you're speaking to an internal audience, like your team or the leaders of your company. These are people you already know to some degree, but the problem, solution, and benefits points work equally well for external audiences as well, like a potential client. Let's fill this in with another short example. This time, we'll pretend we're a staffing company and we're talking to a potential client organization, a growing company with whom we want to do business. The problem would be entirely focused on the challenges that this client is facing. With persuasive speeches, you have to tailor your message at every step to your specific audience. For example, we know this company is growing so fast, they're having difficulty interviewing and hiring people quickly enough to keep up with that growth. And because of the growth, they're having an internal strain around responsibilities that are typically handled by an internal human resource department. Things like compensation, benefits, and keeping track of everybody. The solution we're offering is to partner with us. We'll call it XYZ Staffing. We specialize in helping growing businesses scale up quickly. We streamline the interview and hiring process and have a software package that simplifies compensation and benefits. We tell them exactly what the plan costs, the steps involved, how long it'll take to roll out this whole process. We tell them our proposed plan, in other words. We then transition to our benefits point where we show them how this would save them time and money and get them the help they need so they can grow as rapidly as they want to grow. We'd show them how easy the process is to implement and roll out and show them all about the kinds of success stories that we've experienced with past clients, the victories we've helped other client organizations achieve who are just like them. That's how you structure the body points in a persuasive speech using problem, solution, and benefits. Now let's briefly look at the conclusion. The first thing you do is signal the end of your speech by saying a phrase like "in conclusion" or another one like that. You typically then reinforce your bottom line, your key argument for the speech. I consider it then optional to recap your 3 main points in a persuasive speech. I always do that in an informative speech, but I find it tends to slow down persuasive speeches and isn't really necessary. But in a persuasive speech, you must have a call to action. That's mandatory. And then you finish with what some people call a clincher. This is like an echo of your attention grabber from the beginning of the speech. And you should plan your presentation to finish on a high note like that, with a bang, as they say, and not with a whimper. This structure does raise additional questions that we'll answer in the rest of this 4-part series of videos. One question that comes up is, are there other ways to organize a persuasive presentation besides problem, solution, and benefits? And yes, we'll look at several other ways to do that in part 2 of this series. Another question: how do you come up with all these ideas and information that fill in each of those main points in the body? The third video in this series will show you how to fill each of those buckets for maximum persuasive impact. And that video will also show you how to appeal to listeners' hearts and minds in equal measures as we fill those buckets. And the last key question we'll look at is how to ask your listeners to take that next step at the end of the speech. And that means in part 4 of the series, we'll look at a persuasive conclusion, and I'll show you 10 ways to call your listeners to action at the end of a speech. We're going to look at 3 additional ways to organize the body of a persuasive presentation. In part 1 of this series, we looked at the classic problem solution benefits design. This is part 2 in a 4-part series. Today, we're going to look at 3 alternative ways to structure your main points. They are very similar to problem solution benefits points, as you'll see, but they have slight variations that will give you flexibility. The idea is you would need to select the best approach to fit your particular message and the specific audience you're speaking with. I'll give you recommendations, but you ultimately have to use your best judgment to make that choice. I also encourage you to look at the free resources and classes and group coaching options on my website. I'll put links to the Communication Coach Academy in the description below this video. The first approach is really the foundation to all persuasive messages, and that is the basic problem solution main points. Just 2 main points. All persuasive messages that I have seen have both problem and solution buckets at their foundation. And the most obvious difference between the problem solution and problem solution benefits points that we talked about in the first video in this series is that we're leaving off the benefits here. For example, I might be talking to some of the decision makers in my company, and I'm explaining a problem. They're having a lot of trouble getting new hires up to speed on how our workflow functions. My recommended solution would be to get the entire team together to revise and map out how projects move through the organization. As this example shows, there may be a lot of good reasons not to dedicate an entire point about the benefits. In this case, one reason to leave off the benefits point is that my listeners may be extremely familiar with the issue and not need the benefits spelled out for them like that. A related reason to leave off the benefits point is when there's an extremely tight fit between the problem you've introduced and your solution. When you have that type of message, your solution should cancel out most or all of the problems that you've already introduced in a really obvious way. My solution accomplishes this. If we get the entire team together and revise and map out how projects flow through the organization, then it might sound redundant if I explain how that solution would create benefits. That might be a little like saying, the problem is I'm hungry, the solution is I'm going to eat some food, and the benefits are I won't be hungry anymore. If that benefits point is really obvious for any reason, you may opt to just go from problem to solution and then go to your conclusion. But leaving off the benefits point is not the only difference during an actual speech. My example about the company's workflow is short, but when you're using the problem solution points only, you'll often see speakers enhance or develop their problem point with 2, 3, or even 4 clear problem subpoints that are identified under that overall problem point. When drafting a full-length presentation on a topic, it's almost as if these speakers treat the problem point as its own self-contained speech about the problem. This is usually where a speaker will hit the problem really hard and clearly to build an extremely strong case that there really is a problem with multiple identifiable issues, and then they'll recommend their solution. And in the same way, they may do that with their solution. They may develop their solution point in an equally clear and detailed way with subpoints, almost as if it's a standalone mini speech about their proposed plan. And that makes sense because if your speech has only an introduction, conclusion, and 2 points in the body, then you must make sure those 2 body points are fully developed. The second variation is to use the problem, cause, solution main points. You can obviously still see that we're grounding this in the problem solution thinking, but here we're back to using 3 buckets by explaining the causes of that problem. This is essentially adding another layer to our discussion of the problem by explaining the drivers of that problem at a deeper, more detailed level. Sometimes that will make your speech better. For example, I may be doing a presentation and the problem I explain is that the growth at our company has been close to flat for the past 18 months. Next, I would explain that the cause of the flat growth is due to the fact that all of our existing store locations are maintaining their profitability, but we have reached capacity at those locations. And as a result, we cannot count on continued growth from our existing locations. They're already maxed out. My recommended solution then is to open additional store locations so we can continue to grow the company overall. I've frequently seen the problem-cause solution design used when we're talking to supervisors or leaders or decision makers who are 2 or more levels above us in an organization. If that's the case, you may need an additional point that explains the causes of the problem because those causes may not be obvious to those stakeholders who are not fully aware of those underlying issues. You may also want to talk about the causes of the problem so the specific solution you're about to recommend comes across as a good fit for the problem you've explained. For example, adding new store locations is a much more costly proposal for growth when compared to increasing sales at existing locations. But when I explain in my point about the causes that our existing locations are already at full capacity, then adding new store locations becomes a solution that is seen as a tighter fit between the actual problem we have and the solution we're recommending. That's why I sometimes recommend adding a point about the causes. It may help you create a tighter logical flow between and among your main points, and it'll tell a more coherent story. The third alternative is to organize your main points around the symptom, causes, and treatments. You'll usually see this in healthcare-related fields. This is a little specific and may not apply to your professional setting, but it's still worth learning about because it'll show you just how common persuasive messages are across industries, even though they might be using different terms. It may also help you add some nuances to the way you explain things to clients, to your team, or to supervisors. In healthcare conversations, articles, presentations, you'll hear symptoms, causes, treatments all day long. Let's look at an example, and I'll show you that this is really just a repackaged persuasive message. For example, you go to the doctor to discuss some symptoms that sound like diabetes, increased thirst, more frequent trips to the bathroom, fatigue, blurred vision, unexplained weight loss, and numbness or tingling in the hands and the feet. Some of the causes are insulin resistance, autoimmune disease, hormone imbalances, pancreatic damage, and genetic mutations. The treatments would be monitoring your blood sugar, oral medication, insulin, diet, and exercise. Google almost any medical condition and you'll see the results explained using the symptoms, causes, and treatments as a schema. This may sound fancy or technical, but let me show you how this is really just a variation on a persuasive message design that we've already seen. Talking about symptoms is really just another way to talk about the problems that you're experiencing as a patient. The next point is about causes. That point is the same. You're talking about the causes of whatever problem you're having. And the treatment is really just another word for recommended solution. That treatment is meant to solve or at least manage your medical issue. And it makes a lot of sense that healthcare professionals would use these main points. They're often trying to persuade their patients to adopt a particular course of treatment. So naturally, they organize their ideas in a persuasive way. It's likely already obvious by now, but let's line it all up and look at all these approaches together, and you'll see a clear pattern emerging among them. At the foundation, they all include problem and solution points. Sometimes you want to expand upon the causes of the problem. Other times, you may want to spell out the benefits in a really clear way, the way we did in the previous video. And the symptoms, causes, treatments approach is mostly about using different words with very similar meanings. The reason they all talk about the problem first is to create the motivation to adopt the solution. If you just jumped to the solution and never explained the problem, it wouldn't be a very persuasive message. Those are 3 alternative ways to organize a persuasive speech. Feel free to tell me about your preferred approach and your particular message for your specific audience that you see yourself speaking to. And as mentioned, this is part 2 in a 4-part series about how to write a persuasive speech. In part 3, we'll be looking at how to appeal to listeners' hearts and minds by filling those main points or buckets with the right balance of supporting materials. You're going to learn exactly how to appeal to your listeners' hearts and minds so that you can become a more persuasive speaker. This is part 3 in a 4-part series on how to write more persuasive speeches. In the first 2 videos, we talked about how to organize the buckets in the body, the main points. For example, You can organize that around problem, solution, benefits. Or you might choose just 2 points, problem, solution. And we talked about other variations as well. But the question remains, once we have those main points, what do we put inside them? What supporting materials do we fill our buckets with to make sure the message is more persuasive? And that's what this video is about. To be more persuasive, you have to appeal to the hearts and the minds of your listeners in equal measure. If you neglect either side of the equation, then your message is not going to be as persuasive as it could be. First, if you want to be more persuasive, you have to appeal to listeners' hearts. In this video, I'm going to be using the problem, solution, benefits buckets that we talked about in a previous video as the foundation. But the same advice should be applied to all the other alternative ways we talked about to organize your main points. In terms of content, to appeal to listeners' hearts, you must include what we call specific kinds of supporting materials inside each of those 3 buckets. And there are 4 ways to appeal to listeners' hearts: stories, real-life examples, vivid language, and quotations. All of these supporting materials should be tailored to appeal to your listeners you're speaking to specifically. In the course of an entire presentation, you should distribute these types of supporting materials so you're speaking to listeners' hearts all along the way. And the number 1 way to do that is through telling stories. The story could be as short as 20 or 30 seconds. And if you're a really skilled speaker doing a longer presentation, some stories can last for several minutes. A good story will have a clear beginning, middle, and end. And reaching people's hearts with stories is all about mentioning specific people, taking specific actions at specific times and places. Those specifics will help listeners picture what's happening in the story in their minds, and that will engage their emotions, their hearts. Stories transport us into the world that the speaker is telling us about. A good story can carry us away and engage our imagination and emotions. Stories can be about you, they can be about people you know, or they can be about stories you've read. But make sure you don't steal other people's stories. Give them proper credit and citations if you're referring to something you've read or heard elsewhere. In the same way, short real-life examples also appeal to our hearts. Examples don't tell an entire story. They might just be 2 or 3 sentences long. But as long as they're personalized, they'll reach your listeners. To show you what I mean, I'll revisit an example from an earlier video where I was talking about how to organize a speech around problem, cause, solution, that framework. In that video, I was talking about the problem, how our company had not experienced any growth in the past 18 months. The cause was that all of our existing stores were already maxed out and there was no capacity or room to grow anymore. So the solution I recommended was to open new store locations so we could continue to grow our company. So let's say I wanted to put a short example in the cause bucket of that speech. I would say, for example, CJ owns and manages one of our stores in Albany. His sales are consistently high. They have no vacant staffing positions. His costs are as low as they can get them. And that means there's no way for CJ and his crew to grow their business any larger than it is. It's not an entire story, but we can picture and relate to the real people in those real situations. And that appeals to our hearts in a way that raw data about sales numbers do not. Another way to appeal to listeners' hearts is by using vivid language that paints a picture. You can enhance the emotional appeal of our message that way. If I was sharing an example or story about a, quote, rich neighborhood, for example, I would have to do better than using vague language like nice looking or an upscale. Instead, I would use vivid language that paints a picture in listeners' minds. I would talk about how the homes in this neighborhood have spacious yards with lush green grass. The streets are lined with old growth trees. I would talk about the professional level landscaping that surrounds these $1 million mini mansions with 3-car garages. Now, I don't know if that kind of neighborhood appeals to you, but there's no denying that vivid language like this is much easier to visualize than general language about a upscale, nice-looking neighborhood. The 4th way to appeal to listeners' hearts is through quotations, or at least some types of quotations. As you're in the preparation phase of your presentation, you'll often come across great quotations from a writer or maybe song lyrics that will express the heart of the message that you want to share. But the quotation might say it with a little extra emotional kick than your own words can accomplish. There's this quotation I love that's attributed to the inventor Thomas Edison about working hard. He said, "Opportunity is missed by most people because it is often dressed in overalls and looks a lot like hard work." That's clever, It has some humor to it. I couldn't come up with that on my own. Every time I hear a great quotation like that, I can feel a spark of emotion. So as you prepare your speech, be on the lookout for those great stories, examples, vivid language, and quotations that get your emotional motor running. If they stand out to you, they'll likely stand out to your listeners. Then you distribute them in the appropriate bucket in your speech so that every minute or so, there's another chunk of your message that keeps listeners' hearts engaged. Second, we must appeal to listeners' minds in equal measure if we want to be persuasive. If all we ever did was appeal to listeners' emotions, a good portion of our audience would eventually ask themselves, okay, great story, I get it, but how big of a problem is this really? Appealing to emotions is all about specifics, so you have to balance that out by grounding your persuasive claims in information that establishes general support for your message. The 4 ways to appeal to listeners' minds are through facts, statistics, quotations again, and other types of hard evidence. Basic facts don't have much emotion associated with them, but they speak to our rational side, our minds. Back to an earlier example, if I was talking about our company and how it hasn't grown in 18 months, I'd mention that fact that we haven't opened new stores in 5 years. That fact will be really important when I head into my solution and recommend that we should open a new store. In an earlier video in this series, I was talking about the causes of diabetes, and I was just stating facts like insulin resistance, pancreatic damage, and genetic mutations. Some facts may be obvious, but others may be drawn from your research. The next way to appeal to listeners' minds is by giving statistics that are expressed as numbers and percentages. I sometimes give a presentation in my college classes about the importance of starting a retirement investment plan immediately after graduation. One of the stats I share is that 50% of Americans have saved almost nothing for retirement. You'll often see statistics shown on a graph or a chart, and showing these visually like that can be very persuasive because you can display trends, differences, and relationships between and among the variables that you're talking about. A third way to appeal to listeners' minds is again quotations. Quotations are on both lists because we're talking about quotations from experts here. These quotations will have the kind of information in them that will support the point you're making. If you're trying to persuade listeners that investing in a mutual index fund is a good way to get started, you might want to quote an expert. For example, Warren Buffett. He's one of the richest people alive and he's made a lot of money through investing. He has said for about the 100th time, the goal of the non-professional investor should be to own a cross-section of businesses that in aggregate are bound to do well. A low-cost S&P 500 index fund will achieve this goal. A quotation like this from an expert is excellent evidence that will appeal to listeners' minds. Now it's not just you saying this as the speaker alone, you're bringing in the voices of experts into your speech through their quotations. I've mentioned quotations twice because it's all about the substance of the quotation itself. So how do you know which is which? Well, it all depends on the specific quotation. As a rule of thumb, quotations that appeal to listeners' minds usually come from experts, researchers, and other types of specific knowledge areas. Quotations that appeal to our hearts often come from authors, philosophers, other kinds of writers, song lyrics, sources like that. This is one of those times where you have to just trust your judgment since each quotation is unique. The fourth way to appeal to listeners' minds is through any other type of hard evidence. For example, photographic or video evidence can be incredibly persuasive. You may want to include relevant images and discuss what it shows in your presentation, for example. This is very common in fields like law, healthcare, and other situations where seeing is believing. Another example could be citing the overall results from a research study that show a relationship between important variables. Sharing details from research studies and results will go beyond a mere fact or a single statistic and usually paint an overall picture of hard evidence that appeals to listeners' minds. A positive or negative case study is another example of hard evidence. As you prepare and develop your presentation behind the scenes, be on the lookout for facts, statistics, quotations, and other types of hard evidence. Just like we did when we were appealing to listeners' emotions, we would distribute those types of supporting materials inside each bucket of our persuasive speech so that we keep listeners' rational sides engaged throughout the message. And here's a pro tip on top of that. Within each bucket, be sure you bounce back and forth between these two types of supporting materials. I have found that when speakers give too many statistics or facts or pieces of hard evidence in a row, the information starts to lose impact. It's much better to bounce back and forth, give a statistic or appeal to listeners' minds in some way, and then follow that immediately with something that appeals to listeners' emotions, like a personalized story or example. That back and forth pattern is engaging and persuasive because it continually feels fresh. Alternating like that, as a rule of thumb, is a great way to appeal to listeners' hearts and minds in equal measure. I'm going to show you 10 practical ways that you can call your listeners to action at the end of a persuasive speech. This is part 4 in a 4-part series on how to write a persuasive speech. Look for links to the entire series in the description below this video. One major difference between most other types of speeches and a persuasive speech is that there's almost always a call to action in the conclusion of a persuasive message. It's also one of the areas that many speakers struggle with. So we'll look at 10 practical ways to call listeners to action. The idea is you would use just one of these near the end of your conclusion of your speech. Most of these work well for Zoom presentations as well as face-to-face, but you'll have to adapt my advice to your own situation. Now, I promise we're going to look at 10 of these in a moment, but here's what I mean by a call to action in this video specifically for a public speaking situation. And here's what a call to action is not. It's not the same as a closing tactic that you would see sales people use. Even in a professional situation, you should not use any type of artificial pressure at the end of a presentation to make people feel like they have to agree with you right there or the deal is off the table. I don't teach that garbage on my channel. Most persuasive presentations are the beginning of a presentation, not the end. In the same way, a call to action is not a manipulative, pointless moment of pressure. Calls to action in a speech should not include, for example, a huge commitment or a big challenging step. Instead, think of your call to action as little more than a clear and concise invitation. You're asking listeners, if they like what they've heard so far, to take the natural next step toward the solution you've already explained in the body of your presentation. A good call to action should also be extremely clear, transparent, simple, and it's an easy step for listeners to take. Here's a list of the top 10. There's a little overlap between some of them, but you usually want to pick just one. The key point is that you should be able to deliver each of these calls to action in just a few sentences, almost at the end of your conclusion. Number 1, you can invite listeners to scan a QR code on the screen that leads to, let's say, an opt-in page or some other resource. Now, this is so common nowadays. I wanted to mention it and get it out of the way, but it is still useful. I often use this. If you've done your job well during the rest of the presentation, many of your listeners will want to learn more. And a QR code can lead to almost any resource online and put listeners exactly where they want to be to take that next step. Number 2, you can ask listeners to provide their email address in exchange for a one-time gift. There are lots of reasons they may want to do this. They may want to receive more information from you, receive a one-time gift like a workbook, a checklist, some other top tips that you can provide them, or other giveaways. I don't personally do this, but many speakers will offer to email their listeners a copy of the PowerPoint slide deck. Sometimes even a reminder email is the kind of message listeners will be thankful for, especially if there's some information that's time sensitive or there's something happening on a particular date. Number 3, in the same way, you could have some free items available in physical form that listeners can take away with them when they leave the room. This could be a printed pamphlet or some other type of physical handout. A few months ago, I was doing a presentation with Julian Miravel in person about our book, Positive Communication for Leaders. Julian always gives out a postcard-sized diagram of his model, the Wheel of Positive Communication. On that postcard, there's also a website and other contact information. That little postcard frequently leads to more book sales and additional speaking invitations for Julian. It might seem a little old-fashioned to give a physical object like a pamphlet or a postcard, but many people still like that. Number 4, you can invite them to sign up for an ongoing newsletter. This again involves asking them for their email address or perhaps their physical address if you send a hard copy of the newsletter. Some people still do that. Instead of sending them a one-time freebie like a booklet or a checklist, you'd be inviting them to sign up for an actual ongoing newsletter correspondence with you. This could be high quality information you send out periodically. And it's a nice variation on this call to action because it doesn't have to be uniquely tailored to each speech or each audience. A consultant friend of mine used this to send out a newsletter once per quarter. And it always had helpful, expert level information in it. It was a great way for her to stay in touch with her regular clients who would frequently invite her back year after year to do workshops and executive coaching. Number 5, I've seen many speakers offer a free one-time phone call or consultation or follow-up meeting after a presentation. Like all of these other calls to action, you have to pick one that fits your goals and your purpose, as well as something your listeners would benefit from. Maybe, for example, you're a financial advisor. In that instance, a one-time free follow-up consultation might make sense for both of you. This could also be a follow-up small group meeting. So years ago, I was attending a large presentation that was about helping young people become professional speakers. There were probably a couple of hundred people there in the big room, but the call to action was for first-time attendees to have a follow-up small group meeting immediately after the big presentation. So I attended this meeting with about 6 or 7 other young professionals, and it was really helpful information tailored just for us, and it was well worth our time. Number 6, you could ask your listeners to donate their money, time, or help. You usually see this at the end of any type of nonprofit presentation. Those speakers are often there to raise support of various types from their listeners directly. I know of a nonprofit organization that runs residential facilities for young women with various types of mental health struggles. The leaders use public speaking as one of their main fundraising strategies. They talk about how the organization is helping lots of people, and then at the end of the presentation, in their call to action, they directly ask listeners to donate money to support this cause. Other speakers might ask listeners to donate their time or labor, like helping to fix up a building in the community. Number 7, some speakers who are speaking to an internal audience might be asking listeners for a decision to support whatever plan, project, or cause they're there to talk about. In fact, this is one of the most common types of calls to action that you'll see if you're speaking to your own company. But many speakers aren't clear enough about their call to action here. So you might be speaking to your supervisor or a team of leaders perhaps in your own department. Your project may need their approval or money or simply an official yes. There's always somebody at work above us who can say yes or no. If you're doing a persuasive presentation to an internal audience, make sure you have a clear call to action where you directly ask them to support your project. They may not be able to say yes on the spot, and don't word it in a way that creates artificial pressure or puts them on the spot right there. Certainly more conversation is likely to follow your presentation, but you at least want to be clear on what you're asking them for. Otherwise, if you don't ask directly, they may get the impression you're just there to let them know about your project and inform them in a general sense. Number 8, you may ask your listeners to make a commitment to themselves. Many times you'll be speaking about a topic that's really important, but there's nothing in particular your listeners can do right there. What I've seen some speakers do is ask listeners to pause and make a decision for themselves. I've even seen some speakers distribute, let's say, a small card, a commitment card with some information on it. It could be a commitment to exercise 3 days a week. It could be a commitment to read more books. The possibilities are endless. The idea is to ask your listeners to do at least one small thing, even if it's just to write their own name on a personal commitment card that they keep. That may be an extra step that motivates them to follow through on what you talked about in your message. Number 9, this one is similar. You can ask your listeners to do something right on the spot that is symbolic, a symbolic action, or a bit of practice. Let's say you're giving a speech to college seniors, who I often talk to, and they're about to graduate and get their first full-time job. Your presentation is meant to encourage them to enroll in their future employer's 401k program when they start their career. Now, clearly, they're in the room with you. They're not at their employer's offices, and they may not even have a full-time job just yet. But you're still going to ask them to take a symbolic action, something like you ask them, repeat after me. When my employer asks me if I want to enroll in the 401k program, I will say yes. And then they'd say it along with you. This type of call to action comes in handy when you can't do the actual thing, but it's a little more public than a personal commitment card, for example. Instead, you have them practice aloud or do something symbolic to reinforce your message. And number 10, invite them to have a personal conversation immediately after the speech. I like this one because it's so natural and timely. Almost every time you give a speech, a certain percentage of people will want to meet you, to talk with you, and to engage. In a room of 30 people, a handful of them will hear your message and have the attitude of, let's do this. So you can use that natural desire as a call to action. There's some terminology that professional speakers use. One concept is called back of the room sales. You may have heard of this, where they'll often mention at the end of their speech that they have books or other resources for sale after their speech at the back of the room. But what many speakers say is that the real benefits are what they call front of the room sales, right in front of the speaking area. If they've done a good job in their presentation, they say, if you'd like to talk more, come down to the front after the presentation. I'd be happy to talk with you. This usually leads to great conversations, sometimes leads to additional invitations to do further presentations to other client organizations. Here's a summary of the top 10 calls to action you can do at the end of a persuasive speech, but just pick one of them for each speech. This will go right near the end of your conclusion, but you still may want to share one last concise story or go out on a high note in some other way before you actually end your presentation. I put my call to action in the second to last position in my presentations, and then I finish with what many people call a clincher. This is the end of part 4 of this series, and here's my call to action to you. If you've watched this video, or if you've watched the entire series of all 4 videos, please say hello in the comments section below. And if you do, I will give you a heart and tell you congratulations for finishing the whole series. In the meantime, feel free to take a look at my website and all the free resources there, the group coaching options. It's called the Communication Coach Academy. Links to all of that are in the description below. Until next time, thanks, God bless, and I will see you soon.